Hello, this is Ralph K. Ginorio. Welcome to the 13th installment of my video series adapting my classroom lessons on the history behind the 9/11 atrocities. Episode 13 takes us, starts at the zenith of Islamic Arab civilization, about 1,000 years ago, around the year 1000. The Muslim world has expanded from a small desert town of Medina to encompass Mecca and the Arabian Peninsula, the Eastern Sassanid Empire, the Middle East, the Near East, the North African coast, Spain, and into Asia, deep into Pakistan, to the East Indies, into sub-Saharan Africa, the Swahili coast, and across the Great Deserts to places like Timbuktu. Now, by no means were Arabs the only Muslims. There were many others. Ultimately, the Turks are going to become very important to Central Asian people as time goes on. But for now, let's focus on Arab civilization. An old imperial writer once described life for the savages of the world as short, mean, and brutal. And so it was for our ancestors in the West 1,000 years ago. In the West, our ancestors maybe took a bath once or twice a year, whether they needed it or not. They, to the extent that they were peasants, lived in wattle and daub huts with grass roofs, beside their animals, in the stink, with small house fires in the center of the room, and smoke holes up above that were inefficient drawers of the smoke out. You can imagine the stench, the filth, the clutter, the lack of education. Most people lived their entire lives within a diameter of 20 miles of their birthplace. They were stuck in a role, we're speaking of medieval Western Europe, where you are what your daddy does. This came from late Roman times. They were trying to punish tax cheats, but you end up with the establishment of a feudal system in Western Europe based on birth. You are what your daddy does. What that means is, if your daddy was a farmer and you have a black thumb, it's a shame for your crops. And somewhere in the world there is the worst doctor, or there was the worst doctor. And that's because the family were Medici, they were doctors, and you go into the family business, but you got two thumbs. Oops! Stinks to be your patient. Our ancestors were by far not the best and brightest 1,000 years ago. We were the underdeveloped third world, so to speak. Well, there were glorious things that were happening in High Middle Ages Europe. There were the development of the cathedrals. There were all sorts of things. But the Islamic world was the place to be if you had the option of going back and being a time traveler. They had streets, they had cities with street lamps. They had running water in places, not in a modern sense, but in the sense of a water network that brought waste out and brought clean water in, where there were baths and bathhouses. There were universities where knowledge was gathered. The Islamic world did not suffer a dark age in the sense that they never had a short, sharp shock to the head, at least not up until that point, that knocked most of the ancient knowledge out of them. In fact, the Islamic world built upon the ancient knowledge. They took their contact with Hindu India and the concept of a null God of nothing, of emptiness that is explored by Buddhists, and they develop it into a mathematical concept called zero, a null set, which is the basis of all advanced mathematics. They take Greek geometria, geometry, and develop algebra, Arab math. Arab math is the basis of calculus, it's the basis of trigonometry, it's the basis of all modern mathematics, which is the language of our technical science. We could never have gone to the moon without algebra. So the Islamic world was not only a storehouse of knowledge, they were expanding knowledge. There were travelers like Ibn Battuta who traveled around the Islamic world, recording what he saw, the Islamic Marco Polo, if you will. There were the Sufis who explored the mystical side of Islam. And yes, there were struggles among the politicians, but the city of Baghdad, capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, was considered to be the most beautiful and comfortable city in the world. The faithful were being rewarded. But the Islamic civilization of those times bears little resemblance to the goal offered by Islamists today. Islamists today are profoundly religiously fundamentalist. And a fundamentalist, more than anything else, is a legalist. In Chinese history, you'd have the first Qin emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi. Qin Shi Huangdi was a legalist. He established laws for everything. He was like the people who wrote the scribal law that the Pharisees followed, people who thought that there could be a rule for everything in life, a law for everything in life. And Qin Shi Huangdi was the role model for Mao Zedong in the establishment of totalitarian police state that is communist China. That's one approach to human civilization. Legalism, the law, control. Fundamentalists are not simply nostalgic for a past, because the truth is what they hearken to is not the past that was, it's a past-like world that they imagine without intellectual complexity, without doubt. Without doubt. One of the hearts of my faith is Jesus on the cross shouting out, "Why, Father, why have you forsaken me? Abba, Abba, why have you forsaken me?" He is the Son of God, I believe. How could he have doubt? Well, the whole point of him becoming a human being for a time was to experience life as a human being. How could you be human without doubt? In order to be fully human, he had to have that one moment of doubt, of worry, of anxiety. The Islamic world 1,000 years ago was not a rule book-oriented society. There was the Holy Quran, there were the teachers, there were the prayers, there were the rituals, but it was an intellectually expanding society, a growing society of scholars and thinkers and mystics. A society that was pushing back the bounds of human knowledge. A society that was scientifically and intellectually curious. A society that was anything but what the fundamentalists want our future to be. The cleanest homes, the tastiest, spiciest foods, the best medicine. When our ancestors in the West were practicing leechcraft, slicing open veins at key points and sticking leeches on to suck out the evil humors, weakening patients, spreading death and disease, Islamic doctors were practicing clean, hygienic medicine, which is the basis for modern medicine. The Arab world was the first world. It was a zenith, which is an Arabic world, a high point. It's no accident that Rigel, Alioth, Alhena are all Arabic words that name stars, because the heavens were charted by Arabic astronomers. The modern world began in Spain when the Christian Knights of the Reconquista took over the libraries of the Arabs in Spain and began to translate them. Before that, Europe had the spirit, but it didn't have the mind. So what happened? How does the Islamic world go from its zenith, where it actually begins to break into the Eastern Roman Empire at the Battle of Manzikert, threatening the existence of the Christian shield, protecting Eastern Europe from the Islamic advance? Well, I'll tell you, it's not the Christian Crusader Knights. American liberals and progressives make great hay as they flagellate themselves over the Crusades. How could we do the Crusades? The Christian world was on the receiving end of Islamic holy war from the 600s and 700s AD through the First Crusade at the end of the 10th century. there was no Christian tradition of holy war. There was a Christian tradition of government persecution of minority faiths that came from Rome. There were Christian traditions of social oppression and feudalism. There were Christian traditions of intolerance and even mob violence. This is all true. But the Christian faith and the European kingdoms of the West, and before it the Roman Empire, was never able to make Constantine's dream fully come true of a religion that bolstered the military power of the Imperium. There was no Christian tradition of holy war. But after losing the Middle East and North Africa and Spain to the Muslim threat, after 300 or 400 years of being on the receiving end of Islamic jihad, Islamic holy war, Christians finally learn crusade. And when they practice it in an amateurish fashion. Starting in 1095, year of our Lord, and extending about 200 years, a series of uncoordinated attacks originate from Western Europe through the Byzantine Empire, the old Eastern Roman Empire, into the Middle East, which is now dominated not by the ethnic Arabs anymore. They are dominated by Mamluks in Egypt, which are former slaves, and Turks. And Kurds. The greatest general of these times on the Islamic side, Saladin, is a Kurd. He is of the Kurdish people, the people of northern Iraq, around Mosul, and in the mountains facing into Turkey and into Iran. So the Arabs are being eclipsed within their society as the Crusader Knights arrive. The Crusader Knights are provoked because there are infractions against pilgrims on their way to the holy sites. During the Islamic zenith, Islamic practices of toleration towards other religion were very much in effect. Christians and Jews were tolerated as fellow people of the book, but they were very much kuffar. They were second-class citizens. If there was any question in the law between a Muslim believer and a kuffar, the Muslim believer would always be given the benefit of the doubt, and the kuffar could be stripped of their rights, of their privileges at any time and sold in the slave market. But persecution time aside, in general, the Muslims were more tolerant of Christian minorities and Jewish minorities in their midst than were Christians tolerant of religious minorities in their midst. But the new rulers of Jerusalem made it harder and harder for Christians to go there as pilgrims, and this was a pretext for the first Christian Crusades. The Crusades are initially successful. In 1099, Jerusalem falls. And at this point, the rulers of Europe, up until now crusading had been a second and third son endeavor, the rulers of Europe get involved. And the next crusade is led by Friedrich Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, who dies while crossing a river. He's drowned in his armor. And ultimately, Richard Lionheart, King of England, takes over and leads the most dramatic battles of the crusading era between himself and his Christian armies and Saladin, the Kurdish general. But ultimately the Crusades never accomplish their goal, which is to make Christian the Holy Land. For just over a century, Crusader Knights hold significant territory in Palestine. Now, they do this because the Muslims are engaged in serious war with another threat, which I'm going to get to in a moment. But the Crusades are never the prime mission of European monarchs or of the Pope. Yes, Peter the Hermit went around shouting, Gott mit uns! God wills it, God's with us. But in fact, the Pope never puts his whole power behind, and the emperors and the kings never, except for the Second Crusade, even then, they never put their whole power behind the Crusades. So the Crusades are uncoordinated and they peter out in the face of superior Islamic numbers, organization, and frankly, skill on the field of battle. Although our knights are pretty darn tough and hard to kill in their heavy armor. In the desert. You see the downside. Ultimately, the Crusades become a travesty, a farce. The worst case is the Children's Crusade, where you have a series of idealistic kids put on ships, and they're told that the innocence of children can break the hearts of the most nasty tyrant. This is idealism run amok. These kids were taken to the Eastern Mediterranean and they were sold as slaves. It was a travesty. It was disgusting, and it broke the back and heart of a lot of crusading impulses in Europe. Now, what do the Crusades have to say to us in the modern era? First, the West will from time to time come in and try to take Islamic land that was formerly Jewish and Christian, but that Muslims insist on calling Islamic land, but that they will ultimately fail. The Crusader states are a temporary situation that resulted in failure because of superior Islamic numbers and skill, and their belief is that God is on their side. How does this affect things today? The peace process in Palestine is insincere because no one on the Arab side genuinely believes in a long-term permanent peace with Israel, because they ultimately see Israel as a latter-day Crusader state that they will inevitably, by God's will, inshallah, drive into the sea and reestablish an Arab and Islamic Palestine. It's inevitable, they think, sooner or later. So if victory is inevitable, like it was inevitable against the Crusader Knights in the 11 and 1200s, why on earth would you make peace with anyone on the other side? This is an aspect that blights the peace process between Israelis and Palestinians, and makes what we would consider a civilized, reasonable solution, which is a live and let live agreement between both sides, ultimately impossible. Because as much as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, there is the conviction on the side of many in the Islamic community that Israel is simply another Crusader state doomed to failure by the will of God and the forces of numbers and economics. Next time, the Mongols, the fall of Constantinople, and the Ottoman Turks. Thank you for your attention.